In 1977, the Moxley family left Belle Haven. They moved to New York City first, and then later Annapolis, where David Moxley began his retirement. Initially, David enjoyed his newfound freedom and time with Dorothy, as their son John had gone to university and started his own adult life. But soon David began to feel restless, and often his thoughts would turn to Martha, regretting not advocating more for her at the beginning of the investigation. In 1988, David decided to return to work and took a new position managing a firm of lawyers. This meant moving back to New York. The Sunday before Thanksgiving, 1998, David travelled to New York to set up the new rental apartment, while Dorothy remained in Annapolis packing up their home ready for the sale. On Wednesday, Dorothy drives to meet David. She hasn't heard from him since Sunday, but figures that he is busy with his new job. On entering the apartment, she was surprised to see that David was still in bed, which was completely out of character. Her surprise turned to shock as she realised that David was dead. He was 57 years old. His family and friends believe that the murder of his daughter had a devastating effect on his health and contributed to his untimely death. Unfortunately for the Moxley family, it would still be another 14 years until the truth about what happened to Martha would come out. But within 3 years of David's death, the case would go from a cold case to an active one, and with a brand new suspect. Welcome to True Crime with Morty, a podcast by a criminologist and her dog. I am your host TJ, and this is Morty. Each week we'll be doing deep dives into murders and mysteries from all around the globe, using my background in law and criminology to give a full account of true crime stories. If that sounds good to you, please consider subscribing, and thank you for joining us today. This is episode 5 in the series Mystery on Walsh Lane, the Martha Moxley murder. Between 1977 and 1990, the investigation into Martha's murder was almost completely stalled. As mentioned in the previous episode, there were discrepancies between the police believing that Tommy Skakel was the perpetrator and the state attorney thinking that the culprit was Ken Littleton. Neither suspect had significant evidence against them, but one had lied to the police and the other had failed a polygraph exam, meaning they could not be eliminated. The police had no other strong suspects, and without any breaks in the case, it continued that way for some time. In 1982, Chief Thomas Keegan said, quote, "I believe I know who killed Martha, but I can't prove it," referring to Thomas Skakel. Apparently he'd told Dorothy Moxley about this theory. The golf club was a key factor in making him a suspect, but Keegan admits there were other suspects, like Tommy's brother Michael. But of course Michael was out of Belle Haven at roughly 9:15, and so wouldn't have got back in time to commit the murder at 10 p.m. Tommy was the main suspect that the police just couldn't discount. Meanwhile, Donald Brown, the state attorney, favoured Ken Littleton due to his failed polygraph exam. So now we're in the 1980s and the chapter of Martha's story that I refer to as the Len Levitt investigation. Leonard Levitt is an investigative journalist from Long Island and graduate of Dartmouth College and Columbia Journalism School. By the time he began investigating Martha's murder, he was an experienced crime journalist, published author, husband, and soon-to-be father. In an ironic twist, Len's career as a journalist had been started by the Kennedy, and in his book on Martha's case, he credits them with this, as it is due to him joining the Peace Corps after college, a scheme started by President John F. Kennedy that got him into his first journalism job. While in the Peace Corps, Len wrote a book about his experiences in Tanzania and the Peace Corps life. The book was published and received glowing reviews, which got the attention of a man called Sterling Lord, who was a publisher who recognised Len's talent and managed to get him off the waitlist and into Columbia University using his connections. After his graduation, Sterling Lord found him a job reporting crime for Detroit News. He later worked at Time and Newsday, where he continued with crime desk reporting. Len Levitt first gets involved in the Moxley case in 1982. He received a phone call from a friend and former colleague at Newsday called Ken Brief. Ken had recently moved to Greenwich to work as an editor for a local newspaper, the Greenwich Times, and he had called Len to catch up about how his life was going, as Len was the one who encouraged him to make this change and apply for the job. Ken had really enjoyed his move to Greenwich, but everywhere he went, he heard whispers about this unsolved Moxley case and its connection to the Skakel family. In his phone call to Len, he proposed that Len visit Greenwich and write an article about the story. Levitt was interested, as from his perspective it sounded like a rich family had gotten away with murder with help from local police. It's a great story for an investigative journalist and a chance to get Martha's case out in the open. Additionally, he was no longer working at Newsday, so this story was a lifeline for him and his family, with his wife Susan pregnant with their first child. Ken sent Len some news articles on the case to get him up to speed on the investigation. Len applied for the police report under the Freedom of Information Act and began his own research to write the article on Martha's murder. On reviewing the police report, Levitt noted that, as stated in the newspapers, the police had spent the first few days looking into the possibility of the culprit being a hitchhiker or an outsider to Belle Haven. Len could not quite understand why they would do this, rather than someone like Tommy who was glassed with Martha, echoing the sentiment of every other detective who has looked at this case. When they did speak to the Skakels, the report stated that they started with Julie Skakel, not Tommy, and didn't really do any follow-up interviews with key players like Ken Littleton and Andrea Shakespeare. Len Levitt's knowledge of crime, from his connections with detectives from his crime desk reporting, told him that this was an unorthodox approach. He also noted the difference in treatment that suspect Edward Hammond received versus the lack of formal searching at the Skakel home. Levitt did understand the investigation of Edward Hammond. He lived next door, he had been home alone, and he had some blood on his clothes, which turned out to be from an accident he'd actually hurt himself. But the police would want to test that and collect any further evidence, like hair samples. What he, and I, TJ, don't understand is why Tommy only got a fraction of the attention Edward did, and the Skakel house, where the murder weapon came from and where Martha was last seen, was not scoured for evidence in the way that Edward Hammond's house had been. The detectives had discovered that the murder weapon was from the Skakel home at around 5 p.m. on the 31st of October. However, as Rushton Skakel had not returned from his trip at that point, they did not collect the golf clubs for 2 days. And of course we now know that that set of golf clubs had gone missing by then anyway. As mentioned in a previous episode, they didn't start a search warrant procedure for the Skakels despite them owning the murder weapon and the rest of the clubs going missing. Len tried to contact David Moxley at his New York office to interview him for the article, but David didn't want to talk to him at this point. Similarly, Ken Brief had a connection to Bob Icks, the Skakel and Moxley neighbour, and when they tried to make contact to talk to him about this case, he also refused, citing the police as the reason and saying that they had warned him to not talk to avoid prejudice to the case. However, Len did manage to get Dorothy Moxley to meet him for an interview. Dorothy was desperate to talk about Martha and help her case. She thought journalists might succeed where detectives were stuck, and at the very least it would raise public awareness. Their meeting would be the start of a decades-long friendship. In reading the police file, Len discovers that the access to Tommy's medical records were down to David Moxley making a personal plea to Rushton. In an earlier episode, we discussed assessments made by Dr. Bloomingdale on Tommy and Michael when they were younger, prior to Martha's death. According to the police report, the police had asked Mr. Moxley to approach Rushton Skakel directly and ask him about access to these files. This led to a contract being made between the families that a doctor working on behalf of the Moxley lawyers would have access to the reports, not the police directly. And this is why the investigation into Tommy went on hiatus 5 months after the murder, and why Donald Brown made a statement saying that a certain family were impeding the investigation. They had already stopped cooperating at that point. In 1983, Len Levitt contacts Christopher Roosevelt, the lawyer from the Whitby School, who had called the police and insisted Tommy would be declared insane if he went on trial for Martha's murder. He tells Len that he'd told Rushton Skakel to act in Tommy's best interests and get legal advice and representation. This confirms why Rushton suddenly withdrew permission for police to investigate Tommy, as we suspected, and may explain why Rushton collapsed. No doubt this conversation scared him, even if no one in his family confessed or admitted anything, as police had suspected at the time. The lawyer had made it clear that Tommy was in a lot of trouble, and it had frightened Rushton. Len also contacted some other witnesses and suspects, Tommy Skakel, Andrew Shakespeare and Ken Littleton. Andrea Shakespeare repeated her story that she told police, confirming Tommy's account that Martha left around 9:30 p.m, at the same time as her and Julie had left, and that Tommy went inside where he handed Andrea the keys to Julie's vehicle. Levitt did not take well to Andrea Shakespeare and admits he wasn't paying close attention to what she was saying, as she had some more information that was very important to the case that was about to come out, but he sort of missed it. The interview ended before she really got a chance to tell him about it, and he'd kind of dismissed it at the time, along with another important clue, when he spoke to Tommy. See if you can pick up on this subtle hint that he missed when he was speaking with Tommy. When Len met Tommy, he was living in Bedford in New York and was aged about 24. Mr. Levitt and a fellow reporter, Kevin Donovan, went to interview him in person, hoping that he wouldn't slam the door in their face. When speaking with Len and Kevin, Tommy said he, quote, couldn't remember making out with Martha as Helen and Jeff had left, which is very convenient and is the opposite to what the other witnesses have said. He also said, and this is a direct quote from Mr. Levitt's book, "The last thing I remember is saying goodbye to her and going back into my house. I didn't know her. Michael liked her. I didn't." It kind of just reminds me of the Mariah Carey meme, "I don't know her," only less iconic. But did you hear the hint? Len Levitt and Kevin Donovan were so surprised that he, quote, couldn't remember making out with the girl who was murdered less than an hour later that they missed the obvious part of that sentence. But I bet you guys picked up on it. I bet you got it, yeah? More on that later. But let's get back to Len Levitt's investigation. His next interview was with Ken Littleton. In the intervening years since Martha's death and his problems in Nantucket, Ken Littleton had spiralled even further. His mental health had suffered greatly, and he was in and out of hospital and suffering from hallucinations. He was also doing some truly bizarre things, like drinking toilet water. Speaking of bizarre, he had a very weird fixation with and fear of the Kennedys. He had been known to collect JFK matchbooks, and at one point impersonated JFK himself by delivering the famous Ich bin ein Berliner speech while standing on top of a 16-foot structure. Naturally, he was arrested for this, and he gave the name Kenny Kennedy to the officers and told them that he was the black sheep of the Kennedy family. It was also clear that Ken had been haunted by Martha's death. He had called David Moxley one Halloween to talk to him about their, quote, mutual tragedy. I'm just going to stop here and say that this sentence gives me pause. I have always felt it was obvious that Ken Littleton didn't kill Martha, and that his erratic behaviour was due to him struggling with his mental health, and of course the impact of being around this violent death had on his career, and then his sense of safety and stability. And I'm sure that's what he meant when he said that to David Moxley, but it really did make me pause, because that is a really odd thing to say to the victim's father when you don't actually know the victim yourself. How is it a shared tragedy? Anyway, in Ken's defence, he was calling Mr. Moxley with an offer to help him solve the case. He offered to take the sodium pentothal, the truth serum, to see if it would help the police investigation, thinking it might help him clarify his own memory of that night, as by now Ken had learned that Tommy had also lied to him about that non-existent Abraham Lincoln report. And Ken was worried that Tommy had used him to concoct an alibi, and he had assumed the police had not realised the implication of this when they had discovered Tommy's lie, as Ken had always been defensive of Tommy, thinking he couldn't possibly have done it because he was with me and doing a report. He now knows the report didn't exist. Mr. Moxley wrote about this conversation in a memo, which Dorothy Moxley discovered after he passed away. Mr. Moxley felt that Ken was doing this for his own peace of mind as well as the investigation, which makes sense to me. Ken Littleton no doubt wanted to help the Moxleys, but he has such complex mental health issues, it really seems to me like this tragedy and the subsequent investigation had affected his mental health to quite an extent, as well as other areas of his life. If the case was solved, it would help him. Mr. Moxley's memo suggested that the sodium pentothal should be administered by an independent forensic expert, and someone else who had a great knowledge of the case who would be able to, quote, frame the questions. As we discussed in a previous episode regarding polygraphs, the questions being asked are important for accurate responses, and the way they are worded and the sentence structure is key to finding out the truth. His suggestion for who could frame the questions and know exactly what to ask was Len Levitt, as by this time, David Moxley had met Len and talked to him a little bit about the case. When he did meet him for interview, he told Len that he'd regretted not pushing the police more or using an incentive like a reward to get information about his daughter's case. However, back in 1983, none of this had happened yet. When Len met with Ken, he was only at the start of his long journey into getting justice for Martha. He has yet to become friends with the detective that solved the case or gain the trust of the Moxley family. Littleton was living in Canada and doing really well. He had a partner, Mary, who later became his wife, and 2 young children. He was no longer homeless and drifting. He had stability in his life. He was undergoing treatment for his alcohol dependency problem, and Len described him as actually quite eager to talk about the case. Ken repeats what he told the police, that he didn't actually know Martha and that he had nothing to do with her murder. He had also believed that Tommy was innocent, although now he was more suspicious because of the lie about the Abraham Lincoln report. He said to Len that the police had tried to push him, Ken, to confess. And he told Levitt that he was cooperative at first, but after his Nantucket issues, things changed. I assume that's due to the polygraph fail and the police treating him differently, more as a suspect, and, as he said, pushing him to confess. And that caused Ken to retreat and not help them, and of course his lawyer advised him not to take a second polygraph. But this does contradict what the police say about him being defensive from day one, so I'm not sure if he was as cooperative as he thinks he was initially when he was trying to protect Tommy. Anyway, here is the really interesting bit about what Ken Littleton told Len. He said that although he had no reason to suspect Tommy at the time and had in fact defended him to the police, he had given circumstantial evidence about someone else back in 1976. And that person was Michael Skakel. Are we seeing a pattern yet? Ken told Mr. Levitt that he told the Greenwich police that Michael frightened him, even though he was only 15 at the time and Ken was a big guy who was 23, and that Michael was already an alcoholic at 15. He proceeds to tell Len some truly awful stories about Michael harming animals, which we will come back to in a later episode. But Len points out that the police have eliminated Michael. It's irrelevant. He was at the Terrians at the time of Martha's murder. How could he have done it? So Ken Littleton was the last interview for the article, and Levitt writes up his big piece and is thoroughly convinced that significant interfering has let someone get away with murder. But Levitt is left with the understanding that the police were not corrupt and that they may just have been trying to hide their incompetence. In his book, he explains that he believed Keegan and Lunny wanted to solve this case. They had really tried to do this for Dorothy, and she had told Mr. Levitt that she trusted them, that they were, quote, sincere. He'd interviewed the police and just come to the understanding that they were a bit stuck, rather than they were deliberately trying to withhold evidence or look in another direction. It was more of a mistake. So his article research had left him with only one conclusion: that the police had not assisted someone in getting away with it, but they had simply made some errors and were dealing with very skilled attorneys at the same time. The interference was in protecting the Skakel children from scrutiny and keeping the police at arm's length. And that interference was from the Skakels and their many connections, not the police themselves. And yet, there was more interfering to come. Len completes his article, and here is where he starts to, quote, get mad. His article was not published due to the fear it would, quote, ruffle feathers. So back in 1984, Ken suspected that there was some fear preventing his report being published. He had tried to give a balanced account of the people involved, but it seemed that any mention of the Skakels at all was enough to stop this seeing the light of day. Initially, he was given delays and a bit of a runaround about when it would be published, and then eventually he ended up in a huge fallout with the publishers and the editor, his friend Ken Brief, at the newspaper. They had asked him to look into this story, and now they were pulling him off of it, something which had never happened to him before, despite doing a lot of high-profile investigations in crime. This was particularly odd for a newspaper that frequently tackles scandals around lawyers and judges, famously litigious people. So why the cover-up now? Why can't they print Martha's story? Len was frustrated. While Len spends the next few years fighting to get his article published, the Moxleys go through many changes. As discussed earlier, David retired and passed away in 1988. A year later, John Moxley got married and started a family of his own. The death of his father encouraged him to, quote, step up and help his mother advocate for Martha. Meanwhile, Rushton Skakel's issues with alcohol continued to get worse. He's even spotted wandering around Belle Haven carrying a golf club. His new wife, who, by the way, is also called Anne, spelt with an E, just to confuse me further, she's notified of him wandering around with the golf club and doesn't understand the implications of it or why the neighbours are concerned. She has no idea about the crime. It's almost like these people just don't care. So Martha's murder remains unsolved and looming over Greenwich. But then, horror strikes again in 1984, around the time Len Levitt first notices pushback on his article, and almost 9 years after Martha has died, Greenwich has another child murder. on August 31st, 1984. 13-year-old Matthew Margolis was seen walking near the Byron River. It was presumed he was going fishing as normal, but Matthew did not return home. His whole neighbourhood and a bunch of volunteers go out looking for him. The FBI joined the search, and a psychic was even brought in after a couple of days, and she made a staggering prediction. Sharon Robinson stated that, quote, Matthew's body would be found on a nearby steep hill by an unknown male. Sure enough, on Wednesday the 5th of September, 5 days after Matthew was last seen, Fred Lambert, one of the volunteers, climbed up a steep ridge that was opposite the river, and he spotted a pair of trainers. He immediately took them to police and showed them to the spot on the ridge where he'd picked them up. Matthew's body was found nearby under a pile of rocks and branches. He had been the victim of a truly sadistic murder. This was not the rage seen in Martha's death. This was completely different, but equally horrifying. He had been repeatedly stabbed over a dozen times, and he had been strangled with his own t-shirt, with yet more shallow cuts to his neck. There were sticks and mud poured down his throat, and he had been gagged with a sock. Much like Martha, he had had his clothing removed, but again there was no sign of sexual assault. The murder weapon, a 10-inch kitchen knife, had been found at the scene. Now, I'm going to do a few episodes on Matthew's murder. As of recording, it's still unsolved, and it's an important story, and it should be shared given this already been over 40 years at this point. But I'm going to talk about this quickly here, as I think it has some relevance to Martha's case and the lack of solving. Much like Martha's case, the Greenwich police really wanted to solve this, and they had the help of FBI legend, who I've already mentioned before on this podcast, John Douglas. He profiled the killer for them. The profile stated that it was a white male living nearby who knew that Matthew fished daily, and the killer is likely to have an unkempt appearance and be antisocial, and that he was likely to feel remorse over the killing of Matthew. Greenwich police also enlisted the help of Vernon J. Gibbeth, a name recognisable to most true crime fans and professionals, but if you are unfamiliar, he is a retired New York homicide detective. He was actually Lieutenant Commander of the NYPD, I believe. Either way, he wrote the book Practical Homicide Investigation back in 1983 as a standard practice guide for detectives to reference when investigating murders. These days, he's often featured in true crime TV shows, documentaries, podcasts, etc., sharing his expertise on infamous cases. His analysis of the investigation into Matthew's murder was positive. He felt that the police had done a good job, but they had lost some advantages due to the 6 days before the body was found. Gibbeth pointed out that the perpetrator would probably act strange immediately after the murder, where his neighbours or friends may notice he is different. But as the days passed and the police didn't turn up, he would probably collect himself and calm down, maybe conceal evidence, and by the time the police did come, assuming he was on their radar somewhere, he would be back to normal. Of the killing itself, Gibbeth stated that it was a lust killing where the motive was in the mind of the killer, a fantasy of theirs, and not something that would be immediately apparent to the police. It would be committed on the spur of the moment, and the perpetrator would be enacting a fantasy, something that they'd thought about before, but it wasn't premeditated in the traditional meaning within investigations. In his opinion, cases like this were extremely hard to solve. Undeterred, the Greenwich police interviewed over 1,000 people in this investigation and put together a list of their top 5 suspects. But no evidence was found linking any of them to the crime. The residents of Greenwich had a suspect in mind though, a teenager who lived right where Matthew's body was found and was known to bully Matthew and other children. In fact, earlier in the summer, he had literally tortured and stabbed another boy, and seemingly only stopped as the people living above the basement where this was happening had returned home and interrupted his crime. I have so many questions about what was going on there, but we'll save it for the deep dive. The Greenwich police did not mess about. They pulled this teenager in for questioning just hours after Matthew's body was found. His alibi was that he was working from 4 p.m. till 10:40 p.m. on the 31st of August when Matthew went missing, at a local Wendy's, which is a chain restaurant in America, and apparently that is what cleared him from this investigation. And so we have another unsolved murder in Greenwich involving a child with double M initials. But as we close out the 1980s, there is yet another tragedy we must touch on. Another unsolved murder, but this time at least it was not a child. No less tragic though. Mary Kaposa, a married mother of 2, disappeared suddenly. She was in the process of divorcing her husband, and then, in 1987, On, if you can believe it, October 30th, yes, 12 years to the day of Martha's murder, Mary disappears. Her body is found a month later in the Kensico Reservoir in New York. For the Greenwich Curse believers, it was no surprise that Mary's murder remains unsolved. However, I struggled to see how this was not an open and shut case. But we have to leave Mary and Matthew there and return to Martha, but I will talk about them at a later point. But for now, I think you can just see how this emulates the lack of resolution in Martha's case. Obviously, when Matthew was killed, police needed to put all their focus on his case. Martha's case had been cold for years at this point, so it was important to focus on him, and they could learn from their mistakes with Martha. Yet they had almost the same problem as with Martha. The delay in finding Matthew's body meant the killer had almost a week to cover up their tracks, much like how the Skakels were not top priority after Martha's murder, which, if they were involved, gave them the same opportunities as Matthew's killer. And although this wasn't the same, it wasn't police error, they were kind of back to the same problem of they'd lost significant time on key suspects. So no justice for Matthew or even Mary, which to me seems like they would have had at least one key suspect for that one. 9 out of 10 times it's the husband, right? But both cases remain unsolved. And so it appeared that the Greenwich Curse had struck again, twice. But very soon, the Kennedy Curse was going to make a comeback. The 80s had been a disaster for Greenwich police, but the 90s were all about solving Martha's case when the Kennedy family became a lightning rod for attention. March 1991, 4 a.m, Palm Beach, Florida. Patricia Bowman calls 2 friends from the Kennedy compound and tells them that she has been raped. They take her to a rape crisis facility and then to the police, who take her report and manage to collect semen via a rape examination kit at a local hospital. Patricia had severe pain and bruising, which seemed to confirm her allegation that this encounter was forced and not consensual. Patricia tells police that she'd been out having drinks in Palm Beach the night before, on the 29th of March, 1991, and she'd met William Kennedy Smith, nephew of JFK, out with his uncle Ted Kennedy. For those of you trying to keep track of Kennedy scandals, Ted was the one that was involved in the Chappaquiddick incident that I mentioned in the last episode. William and Ted were also out with Ted's son, Patrick Kennedy. William Kennedy Smith and Patricia had gone back to the Kennedy Beach House, the compound, with Patrick and another lady from the bar. When Patricia and William went off on their own for a walk along the beach, it was there that the alleged attack took place, where she claimed that he had raped her. The police felt that they had enough evidence to prosecute, and so he was charged with second-degree sexual battery and misdemeanor battery. The William Kennedy Smith trial was an international sensation and came off the back of other reports of Kennedy bad behaviour, which was mostly things like infidelity amongst the Kennedy men, but there were some more serious incidents like Chappaquiddick, which meant that the public were suitably outraged by this new allegation. However, despite the backlash from the public, the evidence of the trial was not enough to convince the jury. William Kennedy Smith was acquitted. Why? Well, I assumed it was down to lack of evidence. Rape is notoriously underreported and really hard to prove even when it is. The attrition rate, which is the conversion of reporting a sexual assault or rape to the police and this leading to a conviction of the perpetrator, has always been less than 5%. In fact, for this episode, I checked attrition rates in the UK, and to give you some idea, in 2022, there were 70,330 recorded rape offences within the UK. However, only about 3.2% were prosecuted, and only 2% of that led to conviction, which means that the attrition rate for rape in the UK in 2022 was 2%, which is even lower than I thought. So that means that 97% of the rapes and sexual assaults that have been reported to police in 2022 were not prosecuted. There was no further action taken with them. And only 2% actually led to a conviction where the rapist went to prison. So because of all of that, I was not at all surprised to hear that he had been acquitted, as I know how hard it is to prosecute these cases. However, whilst researching this case, I realised that they had evidence. They had semen. She had bruising that was visible. And it actually came down to credibility of the parties. He said it was consensual sex, and he was believed despite Bowman passing 2 polygraphs, which, granted, are problematic, but she also had this visible bruising, semen, all the rest of it, and she wasn't believed. Now, I would argue that this is because he was a Kennedy and she wasn't. But in fairness, this is simply just a typical outcome of such prosecutions. Due to rape culture, victims are rarely believed, and so when you're up against someone with a name like Kennedy, what are you going to do? But I would also like to point out that although this is all alleged and he was acquitted, there were several other accusations made against him both prior to and after this trial. One of these allegations was in fact also in 1991, before Patricia Bowman's alleged assault in March. These allegations that were made prior were not heard by the jury in this case, which is quite common, it's due to prejudice, but it looks to me at least that we have a pattern of behaviour here, as obviously it continued after 1991 and there were reports made in the late 1990s. Patricia Bowman was known as the Blue Dot Woman to protect her anonymity during the case, but later came forward with her identity to encourage other victims to report their assaults. She stands by her allegations. So what does this hideous situation have to do with Martha's case? You know how these days, if like a celebrity attends a tacky wedding in Venice, aligning themselves with oligarchs and genocide, or if a famous YouTuber shows their racist or misogynistic nature, or in some cases just, message minors. And understandably, the celebrity or YouTuber gets cancelled. And this leads to pop culture sleuths scouring the internet for proof and receipts in the form of old tweets, videos, photos, showing that this person has always been awful and it was right in front of our faces. You know when that happens? Well, this Kennedy rape trial was the 1991 version of this type of cancellation. By this point, the public were getting a bit fed up of outlandish Kennedy behaviour. They were still mostly liked, but people were starting to notice who the Kennedys really were. Of course, back then we didn't have social media and the receipts and all that. Almost every interaction with celebrities was highly curated fluff pieces done by their PR in magazines or tailored interviews centred around a specific project or event. But people who had a platform, like journalists, were looking at this accusation and kind of seeing it as the final straw. And the goodwill that was extended to the Kennedys for their many public tragedies was wearing thin in light of these constant scandals. This led to the 1991 equivalent of a YouTube commentary video where people are pissed off and dragging up all the previous dirt on the person. That's what people did to the Kennedys in 1991. Now, amongst these many justified criticisms and genuine scandals that happened, one journalist mistakenly thought that William Kennedy Smith had been in Greenwich the night of Martha's murder. He was not. Cannot stress that enough, but he really wasn't. There was no doubt this was just a confusion between the Kennedys and the Skakels. In fact, some thought that the Kennedy that had been there on the night of Martha's murder was Robert F. Kennedy Jr. You know, the man who's currently in charge of ruining America's health. That guy? Yeah, they thought he was there. Neither Kennedy was in Belle Haven that night, but this was mixed in with other correct criticisms of the behaviour of the Kennedy men and actual scandals that they had been involved in, and it led to Martha's case being thrust back into the media at the height of this Patricia Bowman investigation and trial. Dorothy Moxley, who had spent years advocating for her daughter and having no idea how to push forward for justice, saw everything change almost overnight. Then Levitt, who had battled to have his article on the case published since the mid-80s, suddenly saw it splashed on the front page on June 2nd, 1991. His article received a great deal of praise and created even more interest in Martha's case. August 8th, 1991. New Greenwich Police Chief Ken Mouty, along with Donald Brown and his investigator Jack Solomon, announced they were reopening the Martha Moxley investigation. They introduced Detective Frank Garr, who was the cold case investigator assigned to the case, a tip line and a $50,000 reward for information. Tips started to come in straight away, but the public were not giving information about Tommy Skakel or even Ken Littleton, and there was no mention of the Kennedy cousins who'd been suspected of being there. The tips were all about one person, someone crucial to the night Martha died, but who had largely been overlooked by the police. Michael Skakel. Join us in the next episode for another deep dive into the police investigation, where we will take you through the 90s cold case inquiry in our 6th episode of Mystery on Walsh Lane, the Martha Moxley murder. But for now, thank you for listening to True Crime with Morty. Please like, comment and subscribe so you don't miss an episode. Goodbye from me and goodbye from Morty.